this finds you well. Today I've come down onto the karstland at Bannockburn and Stirling as part of our continuing series of looking into the Battle of Bannockburn, its significance to Scotland in 1314, what it meant going forward, perhaps where it took place, and the significance of the Battle of Bannockburn to Scotland today. What does it mean to Scotland today? So we're going to look at perhaps where it took place. I'll give you an outline of the battle and discuss the aftermath of it. So before we go any further, someone asked me, Mark, you keep talking about a karst. What is a karst or a karstland area? Well, a karst is simply a flat area of ground that usually lies adjacent to a tidal river. In this case, it's a river Forth, which is behind me to the north here. And it's considered that the English came down on day 2 of the battle onto the karstlands here to camp for the afternoon and resume day 2 of the battle down here. So before we go forward, I shall give you a wee indication of where I am and then an outline of the battle. This is an 1800s map of the Stirling and Bannockburn karst area. Here we can see the Bannockburn at its confluence with the tidal river Forth, and the Bannockburn as it meanders its way across the flat karstlands. There's a great loop in the burn there which is no longer there, as there's a new road goes over there, but the Bannockburn continues to meander its way as it did in 1314 across the flat karst. You might just be able to make out a bit of a ridge here, running along here. That's the boundary between the flat karst in this direction and the high ground where the Scots camped in this direction. So this is a high ground here where the Scots had the woods and forest behind them, and it was a great defensive position for them. Up here is Stirling Castle, so you can see its kind of proximity to where it's regarded that the battle may have taken place in this area here. Let me show you the modern version of how it is today. So here we are. You can see how built up it is now. Here's the confluence with the Forth and the Bannockburn as it meanders its way across the karstland. Here's that ridge line that we talked about earlier. You can see the housing on the karst below it at Bray Head and Broom Ridge. This is Springker's industrial area, and this is a high ground where the Scots were camped somewhere in this area. You can see day 1 of the battle, which was somewhere in this area, is practically all built on. A good part of day 2 is now built on, with industrial sites at Springker's and housing here. There are some areas left, and this is the wooded knoll, where it's regarded the English may have had a camp, Scotland's answer to the grassy knoll, and the English may have been pushed into the Bannockburn and to the Forth here. Let me just go back and show you that in relief. If we bring up the LiDAR map here, you'll see the difference between the high ground and the karst a lot clearer. Here's that ridge line we talked about, and to the north of it is the flatlands of the karst. This is the area where Springker's was. You can just make that out in the LiDAR. And here's the Bannockburn meandering its way across, and the confluence with the Pelstream. The high ground on which the Scots were camped. The Scots came down onto the low ground. English camps been in this area, if I can just show you that. Probably somewhere in this area. Many people regard it to have been so anyway. And the Scots have come down from the high ground and pushed them in this direction here against the boundary of the Pelstream and the Bannockburn, and in the ensuing crush, when the panic broke out in English ranks and they fled the battlefield, they fled over the Bannockburn, where it's said that many drowned, probably over the Pelstream towards the Forth, where it's also said that many drowned, and many fled up towards the castle as well, where they were captured. So that's an idea of where we are, and I hope that helps give you some kind of proximity to perhaps where the battle took place. To my south here is St Ninians and Milton, just past the Balquidderrock Wood, just outside Stirling. To my right hand side in this direction is the way to Stirling Castle. To my left hand side is the Bannockburn itself. Over to the right we have another burn called or a stream called the Pelstream. And to the north, behind me here, we have the tidal River Forth. So I'll try and put it up on a drone map to give you a better idea of where we are. So with regards to the Battle of Bannockburn, we know it took place over 2 days. Why did it come about? Well, a very rough outline. Edward I of England a number of years ago had invaded Scotland and subjugated it, and Scotland had suffered many, many years of tyranny and oppression under English rule. But they had pushed back against that over the years, ultimately leading to the conflict at Bannockburn, where King Robert the Bruce fronted up to King Edward II of England, who had come north with a huge army of 20,000 people to try and subjugate Scotland once more. Now, why did they come north at this particular time? Well, the Scots had made a deal with the garrison of Stirling Castle, that if you are not relieved by Midsummer's Day by a relief force, that you will hand the castle over to us. So that was seen as a challenge to the English and Edward, and he came north with an army, a huge army, one of the largest that had ever been seen coming into Scotland, to once and for all try to destroy and subjugate the Scots under King Robert the Bruce. So that's why it came around. So what happened? Well, Robert the Bruce over that period had slowly but surely rid Scotland of the English, and there were only a few pockets of them remaining, Stirling Castle being one. But he had gathered together a huge following, an army of people, and he was determined that as Edward came up, this was going to be the battle to end all battles, hopefully leading to the independence of Scotland once more. So the battle, as we know, was fought over 2 days. The first day of the battle took place to the south of here. The English came up and crossed the Bannockburn with their cavalry, which was ahead of the body of their infantry, but they crossed the Bannockburn to the south of here with their cavalry, ostensibly en route to Stirling Castle to relieve it, but also to face off any Scots who might oppose them. But Bruce, being the master tactician, had marshalled his troops brilliantly and had prepared the main way to the south of here into the castle. He had dug pits and had his schiltrons set up to oppose the English. So a number of battles took place between the Scottish schiltrons, which is a body of men on foot with spears. That's how the Scots fought at Bannockburn. A number of battles took place on the first day between the Scottish schiltrons and a body of the English heavy cavalry. And ultimately, the heavy cavalry were given a bloody nose. They took a bit of a beating, and ostensibly they were pushed back over the Bannockburn from where they came and had to reconvene to continue the battle another day. So the first day of the battle was a resounding victory for King Robert the Bruce and the Scottish army, a huge morale booster for what was a much smaller Scottish army, which they reckon was in the area of about 8,000 to 10,000 people, against the English army, which numbered in total 20,000 plus. So what did the English do after getting a bloody nose on day one? Well, they decided that they would reconvene the next day, so they had to camp for the afternoon and the evening and feed their men, their horses, etc., etc. So where did they camp? Well, we can only look at the evidence. And where did the evidence come from? The chroniclers of the day. Many people wrote about the battle and where the English camped for the evening after day one of the battle. Now the chroniclers do differ. Some were written at the time of the battle, some slightly after. And you have to read it and weave a narrative through it, because you can clearly see there are mistakes in some of it. But under weight of evidence, you can take these different chronicles and come to a conclusion and decide where you think the English camped and where day two of the battle. And for me, and for many people, the area down here in this karstland, which I'll describe once more, certainly comes very, very high on the list of areas that they would camp and conclude day two of the battle. So what would they need? What would be the requirements to camp out for a night? Well, as I say, they had a massive army of 20,000 plus. In the army, they had at least 2,000 heavy cavalry. They had 1,000 archers. They had a huge body of infantry. They had the camp followers, the cooks, the fletchers who made the arrows, the armourers, the squires who looked after the knights. Each knight may have had a second horse. So it would have been a massive body of people that needed fed, watered and rested. A horse alone will drink between 30 to 50 litres of water a day, so they need fresh water. Have they got that down here on the Carshland between the Pelstream and the Bannockburn? Well, the Pelstream and the Bannockburn here is fresh running water. It's only where you get north of the confluence of the Pelstream and the Bannockburn, where the two join together, where you get to that point it becomes tidal and unsuitable for drinking. So they had plenty fresh water here for horses and men. And it's also noted that on the Carshlands, which are dry today and hard standing ground today, and I believe were dry, high standing ground in the majority of the areas back in 1314, it's also known that there was a lot of standing water, pools of water, which have suited the watering of horses and men. They needed pasture for horses, so they have that in abundance down here. And they needed a defensive position. Well, the English might consider that we're flanked by two burns down here, and I don't know if you can see behind me, but there's a raised area of woodland. You might consider it Scotland's version of the grassy knoll, because there's a raised area on the Carshland which would be a good vantage point for the English to look across the rest of the flat lands and see perhaps approaching King Robert the Bruce and the Scottish Army. So did it tick the boxes as a potential bivouacking place for the evening? It does tick. There may be one or two other areas do the same, but this area between the Pelstream and the Bannockburn, before the confluence of the two, certainly ticks all those areas. So what unfolded on the second day of the battle? What unfolded here? Well, it was incredible. It was absolutely incredible. The Scots were on the high ground to the south of here. They had the woods and the forest behind them. It was a great defensive position. But what took the English by surprise was that at the break of dawn, 4:30 in the morning, the Scots came down from the high ground onto the plain, onto the flat ground, and 3 schultrons, 3 bodies of men, all on foot, with their pikes, marching boldly towards the English lines and the English camp. It was almost unheard of for foot soldiers to stand up to heavy cavalry, but the Scots marched across the flat ground, and at some point there was an exchange between the archers of the two sides. The English archers were thrown to the front of their lines, the Scottish archers to the front of their lines. There was an exchange of arrows. Why the English archers then receded, I don't know. But at some point, the cavalry took over. They were seen as the elite force. But the Scots had closed the ground quickly between themselves and the cavalry and gave them little room to get up ahead of steam. The Scots marched into the cavalry met them. There was a terrible clash of bodies and armour and steel on steel. The screams of people, the sweat, the fear, the blood, the gore as they crashed into one another. And the battle reigned there for quite some time. They reckon the battle took between an hour to 2 hours, being stagnant for some time. But the English heavy cavalry could not beat the well-marshalled and disciplined troops of the Scottish army, who stood shoulder to shoulder in their schultrons with their pikes, piking the English horse, piking their heavy knights, taking them prisoner, killing those who opposed them, and ultimately cracks began to form in the English lines. Now, the master stroke of King Robert the Bruce with his schultrons is that Where in the past the schiltrons had been defensive bodies of men with pikes standing still to face oncoming cavalry, Bruce had trained his men to march forward in unison together. Now he had the English trapped between the Bannockburn and the Pelstream, so they couldn't outflank his army. That is the considered opinion of many who think the battle took place here. And it makes sense, because you would try to outflank them. They could not do that with heavy cavalry, because the Pelstream and the Bannockburn would present a significant obstacle. So Bruce had trained his men to march boldly forward with the schiltrons, to press in, not just to stand in a defensive position inviting them on, but to press them back. And he did that. The trumpets would have sounded, the flags would have waved to signal the men forward. The marshals would be signalling them to go forward. The three schiltrons, which came together as one, pressing the English cavalry and the troops behind them who couldn't get past their own cavalry, pressing them back into the ever-decreasing area that then becomes a confluence of the Bannockburn and the Pelstream. At some point in the battle, the English were struggling. They had taken heavy losses. The Scots had broken through. Edward himself had to fight from his horse to defend himself. And his generals decided it would be safer to get the King of England off the field, and he fled with 200 to 300 knights towards Stirling Castle. When the rest of his army seen the King of England flee from the field of Bannockburn, panic set in. The battle turned into a rout as the English turned and fled in all directions. They fled into the Bannockburn, where many drowned. They fled north to the Forth, where it said in the Chronicles that many drowned. And many followed their king towards the castle, where they scrambled about on the crags and the rocks leading up to the castle and were caught and taken prisoner by Bruce's troop. So the battle for Scotland had turned into a rout and a magnificent victory for King Robert the Bruce and his tactics of the day, which the English had no answer. The superior, the much larger English army had no answer for. It was a magnificent victory for the tactics of King Robert the Bruce. So what was the aftermath of the battle? Well, it was the beginning of a journey which ultimately led to the freedom and independence of Scotland from English subjugation once more. And never again under King Robert the Bruce's reign did the English come up and defeat the Scots in Scotland. And in 1328, independence and freedom was gained for Scotland. So what of the battle? Did it take place here? Have we found any conclusive proof that it took place here? Well, no. That's the problem. Over the years, nothing decisive has ever been found that can definitively pinpoint the area of the battle. The battleground would have been cleared by the Scots of all the armour and swords and weapons. They would have used that in future conflicts, so that would have been cleared back in the day. But things are always left behind, things are always lost. But nothing has ever been found. Now, some people believe that there was perhaps a lot of peat in this area, and in subsequent years, during that peat clearance, a lot of the artefacts left after the battle would have been lost forever. We can debate that, and I will look in a future video as to whether this area was peat covered or not. But let's presume it wasn't, because they do talk about the battle taking place on good, dry, hard-standing ground, among the pools. What about the bodies? What about the dead? Now, anywhere between 1,000, 2,000, 3,000 people might have died that day. We know it was quite extensive. It was a rout. The chroniclers of the day tell us that the lords were taken away and given a burial or sent back to their families, a burial on consecrated ground, or given back to their families in England, probably for a sum of money. But the common people, they were buried in pits on the battlefield. But those pits, those dead bodies, 1,000, 2,000 people, they've never been found. Why is that? Well, there's a lot of development taking place on the battlefield. To the south of me on day one of the battle, it's nearly all housing. And to the west of me here in the north, there's a lot of development with roads and industrial development taking place. But during that, they've never found any artefacts and they've never found any bodies. So either they've been missed, people haven't recognised that they're there, they haven't been found, or they are still under part of the undeveloped ground, perhaps where we stand today. So it would be good if we could identify where that was, so that we could definitively mark the area of day 2 of the Battle of Bannockburn, which was a decisive day, which was a day that the Scots attained victory over a much larger force of invading English army. And we should be remembering that. So why should we remember that? Why is it important that we remember the Battle of Bannockburn and other significant points in Scottish history? Well, it's battles like the Battle of Bannockburn that define us as a nation that we are today. The proud nation that we have become today is defined by the actions that we have taken in the past. And the Battle of Bannockburn was one where we stood up against the tyranny and oppression of an invading force, fought back and gained our independence. And you look back and you learn from things like that. And you learn as you go forward about the importance of people, their actions, and how you can come together to achieve things. So there's educational purpose in learning about the events of the past. And we should be marking this area with a memorial, a cairn or a flag, as we have on day 1 of the battle at the National Trust for Scotland Visitor Centre. They have marked it to the south of here. We should be marking day 2 of the battle, the decisive day, the day where victory was won. We should be finding out where it took place under weight of evidence and further archaeological studies to see if we can find anything that pinpoints the area. But under weight of evidence, we should be marking this area with a cairn so that us today and future generations can commemorate and remember the heroic sacrifice that people in the past have made for Scotland to let us become the nation that we are today. And that's very important. It's what defines us. It's what makes us what we are. So I would like to see that as we go forward. It's very important. And I hope you can join me in that. I'm going to be looking at other areas that were involved in the Battle of Bannockburn, and I'm going to be speaking to some other people, including the council, because there are developments going to be taking place in future, and I hope they're not going to impinge on any of the areas of the battlefield. So we are going to look at that, and we are going to have a discussion about what the best way forward is, and ultimately, wouldn't it be good if this could be the start of a process where we could put a pin in a map and say this is where it took place, and we are going to put a memorial down here for future generations to come and remember and commemorate the great deeds and sacrifices that people of the past made for us and for Scotland. So thanks. I hope you've enjoyed the video. Try and tune into future ones if you can, and let's continue this journey.